you gave the story. What does KBA provide to corporate America? Because I know it's just more than just lease auditing. So wait 1 second. I went on your web and I noticed that you do abstracts, you do audits, you put books up FASB, you do the international accounting standards. So why don't you give us a little bit more into this?
I'm not sure why Mark coined the term lease audit. You made an interesting point. You'd think CPAs do this, right? You should have a financial background. Most of us tend to be real estate attorneys. And a lot of that is because the services we provide tend to be so it's for tenants only, and it tends to be on the area of leasing that gets very complex in certain markets, particularly the markets you work in. And it's a lot less about how does a landlord do their math and accounting, and a lot more about how did you interpret the language or lack thereof in a lease over a long-term deal. So the services we offer start with a consulting service that involves looking over both the lease language and the financial implications and just deciding across a whole portfolio, however big or however small, where you might be at risk of overpayment. So that's not really a lease audit. It's more of a grading system to decide where could you be exposed to a problem yesterday, today, or tomorrow. We've built an AI tool that helps support that. We can get into that later. So that's the first thing. That does obviously lead into lease audits, right? So once you've identified the bucket of opportunity, then what do you do? And so again, I don't really like the term, but then there's this entire consulting platform that leads you from, I think I smell smoke. What's the best way to get there to figure out if there's fire? And then how do you put that fire out? What's the best way to do that? So that's a bit of a continuum more than it is like going to audit a landlord. Right. And so there's a service kind of involved in all of that, which could be data analytics, it could be resolution services, it could be auditing. We actually do have the longest practicing CPA and lease audit history running the team. So some of the other services we offer, we help often law firms and their clients draft and negotiate their operating expense, CAM, and lease audit provisions. That is worth its weight in gold, in my opinion, because if you mentioned Mark going down Park Avenue and pointing out what paid for what, there are billions of dollars that change hands in OpEx every year, a lot of which should not have. Believe it or not, there are still a vast majority of tenants don't look at this, nor do brokers. If you want to avoid having to do a lease audit type process, get someone who really knows how to clarify your obligations of additional rent. The issue isn't often the landlord's cooking the books and you don't know it. The issue is that no one knows what to do about something. So the landlord does what's good for them, and it's hard to figure out what the lease says. So we offer a service where we come in and we help large institutions tighten up that language to create more transparency into what the obligations will look like over the course of the lease term. I think that's a very important service. And we now have an AI tool that is, from what I can tell, the world's first automated way to do a desk audit. So we can offer a service that gets rid of the bottleneck that you hear a lot about when you go to a lease administrator in the world, right? Whether it's JLL in Pittsburgh or JLL in Poland or whoever. They're doing their day-to-day stuff, and then they get these recs that come in and it distracts them. They go, I got a bottleneck of all these, line items that I got to check, and we can automate that now. Right now, we're just doing it for our own work because we have a lot of clients that get recs in, and we also like to use it to do our work more effectively. But I do foresee that becoming a service that I think firms and lease administration avail themselves of, because it's going to basically take, a team of 10 to 20 people doing this on a regular basis down to very few, and create a lot of consistency, transparency, and more accuracy over time.
What are the difference of billing errors? I've once heard there were like 3 types of billing error. 1, it's a mathematical calculation. 2, it's an interpretation of something. And the other one is the landlord's being, I don't know if you call it, the landlord's just being very aggressive. So what are the different types you see out there?
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, you can think of the broadest 2 buckets would be objective and subjective, right? So you have objective errors that you could say on a report, this is wrong. And then you have subjective errors. So if you stick with the objective error bucket, math mistakes, you transpose a number, you use the wrong indices, square footage is off, pro rata share is off, right? The stuff that you can actually physically prove through arithmetic. Other objective errors would be if a lease very clearly includes or excludes certain types of costs, and a landlord just is not doing it correctly. But in your world, I think you probably negotiate on behalf of your tenants for them to avoid paying the advertising and marketing costs of a landlord. So if you saw, in part of the administrative cost of running the building, there was a $20,000 fee for advertising. That's a very objective, like pull that out. I don't pay for that. The in between would be not so much math. Yeah. So we're going to move from objective to subjective. Thank you. Yeah. And think more of interpretation on a calculation. And that's what a lot of people don't get if they're not a broker or they're not, a state that sees a lot of deals. Landlords often use several sentences to describe the way they will calculate something. It is not mathematically perfect. For instance, I will do a gross up to 95% of a building. 5% of something seems pretty clear. Well, what are you grossing up? Depends on what the lease says. And those categories can all be pretty broad, right? So do you gross up certain types of costs, right? Controllable versus non-controllable. Okay, that makes sense to people in the business. Well, what's a controllable versus non-controllable? Is it objective or subjective? Do you control your taxes? No. Do you control who you hire to do maintenance? Yes. You control their rates? Not really. So you end up with a mix of math, but then subjectivity into, well, how do I want to do the calculation that makes sense? So that is where you start to play in the lease audit world, because we see so many instances of it. We can both say, well, this is what the lease probably meant, or the lease is pretty clear, but this is how the market reads it. This is how you're supposed to be doing this, that, or the other.
At least it might just say we're going to mark the operating expenses up to 95% of a fully leased building. They might not even show you how they do the calculation.
That's correct.
It's a sentence, but you really need to look at how are you going to do it? What is in the gross up?
That's correct. And so that's a really good example of something that can seem objective, but then ends up subjective because the landlord is choosing what to do within the equation. The far-reaching area that you were mentioning, what's the interpretation? So then what I was saying is then you end up in the realm of full subjectivity, which would be the lease doesn't speak about a phenomenon that's happening, and now we have to figure out what the fair treatment is. Right. Or the lease touches on it, but there really isn't a right answer. The most common lease audit thing, at least on the coast and in Houston, would be base year adjustments. Tenants tend to have the right to do that within a certain amount of time, to look at the base year and say, well, were these figures correct? But how you do that is not determined. What's the fair amount of taxes? Is it the amount of taxes that were levied on the building the year that you took occupancy or the year that you start paying rent? Or do we have to look into the future and decide, well, what's the full amount of taxes that the building is going to pay when it's fully occupied and fully assessed? There's nothing that leases say to that in some cases. And so you're kind of making it up. And that is not what most people think of a lease audit, because people think of a lease audit as go to the landlord's books and records, look at their accounting behavior, which is more objective, right? We're now talking about a world where I don't care how the landlord accounts. They're not doing anything wrong. They're not cooking the books. They're not being aggressive or not aggressive. It's just no one did this right. And there's no way to figure it out without kind of redoing the deal. So it's almost like a realignment of what were the economic expectations when we got together and signed the deal. Let's get to fairer equity, right? That's what we want. So that, it's interesting because it's a big spectrum of things, and most people get focused on, do you got to go inspect the landlord's books and records and do an invoice sample and look at their trial balance and general ledger? 80% of the time you actually don't need that. You might need pieces of it, but you don't need to go to that level of depth. And in the times that you do, then you get someone with a forensic background and you do it. And that's kind of covers the spectrum of what we do.
So at the end of the day, sometimes you don't need the bills. All you just need is the lease to see if there's going to be a drafting error.
The draft, 100%. You can look at a lease without the bills and almost interpret, if you do enough of these, where something might go wrong, right? You can see language. I've seen that go wrong before, or I know the market has X, Y, and Z, and I don't see language protecting that. You always need to see the bills to see if it's actually coming to fruition, right? You need to see some amount of charge to it. But yes,